Hello and welcome back to the second lesson of our series Fusion for Production, the VFX Compositing workflow within Fusion. My name is Helge Maus from pixeltrain. I hope you had a great week, and today we want to have a little bit longer lesson because this lesson here is a really important one. I split it in two parts so that it's easier for you to watch. The topics we will cover are a variety of important ones. The first important topic we want to talk about is why do you want to use a paid version of Fusion Studio or Resolve Studio instead of the free version of Resolve to start with Fusion, for example. But we also will talk about the differences you have in the workflows between Fusion and the Fusion page inside of Resolve Free or the Studio version. So this is a really important one because if you are starting out to checking Fusion, if Fusion is right for you, if you want to use Fusion in your production, you really likely have only the free version of Resolve and there the Fusion page. And there can be really challenging because Fusion inside of Resolve is a part of a really integrated environment, which is the big advantage of using the Fusion page inside of Resolve. But this integrated environment has then its own challenges for you. So you really have to understand the environment and also how Fusion thinks. I hope I will give you some advice here and I give you the right concepts here. So in this first part of this second lesson, we will discuss first the paid version of these two tools so that you understand a little bit what you get for your money and why you maybe want to invest. And then we dive into Fusion Studio to understand the basic workflows of the Fusion Compositing workflow. If you are only using Fusion inside of Resolve, please watch this introduction. Because the first thing is that inside of Fusion Studio, it's much easier to explain how Fusion thinks. So you will see later in the second part inside of Resolve that you know then the concepts and you get much easier around. You also see what you get if you go later to a paid version. So it's really worth your time. But if you are new to Fusion, please watch this part also and then the second part of this lesson. In the second part of this lesson, we will then do the same stuff we've done in the Fusion Studio variant inside of Resolve. I will use Resolve Free for that, so that you are really seeing how the free version works. But then if you later want to update, you have more tools and more stuff inside then of Resolve Studio. We will generate different Fusion comps in different contexts and scenarios to understand really how Fusion works inside of Resolve. And you will see this is a whole bunch of stuff you have to learn. But it's really great because this integrated environment really is one of the strongest points from my perspective to use Fusion not only as a studio version, which is a standalone, but also inside of the context of Resolve Studio, which I like a lot. So this is the introduction. If you like these kinds of tutorials, please subscribe, give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions, please write in the comments below. I'm happy to help. And if you like these tutorials a lot and you learn a lot from them, you maybe consider to become a patron of me. I would appreciate that. But now let's talk about the first topic. Why not only use the free version of Resolve if you want to work? Why is there a free and a paid version of Resolve, which is named then Studio or Fusion Studio? The thing is that there is no standalone Fusion version for free anymore because Blackmagic Design said, okay, you have the Fusion page in the free version of Resolve. That's enough for beginning. So one reason why you maybe want to invest the $300 is that you get a standalone Fusion. And there comes a really important point. Many people think, okay, DaVinci Resolve Studio costs $300 and you also have Fusion Standalone, which is also $300. Do I have to pay both? No, you don't have to pay both. And that's really important. There's a dongle version, there's also an activation code version, and I think there's also an App Store version, which I don't use and I can't talk about that here. But if you buy a dongle for Fusion Studio or for Resolve Studio, this dongle gives you Resolve Studio and Fusion Studio at the same time for free. So same dongle, both softwares. And the same thing is for the activation code, which you can get. The activation code has another advantage, that you can install it on 2 machines at the same time. So you don't need to take your dongle with you if you are on work or at home. You have it on 2 machines at the same time. But it's the same thing. You get then Resolve Studio and Fusion Studio at the same time with the same activation code. That's nice. Another big difference, which is now a little bit more under the hood, is that the Studio version of Resolve, you get hardware acceleration. So if you have a good hardware, if you maybe also have multiple GPUs, you get this acceleration only in the paid version. This is a big point if you have big projects and comps and things like that. That's really cool. Also, the free version of Resolve doesn't export video files and results bigger than 4K. I think it's UHD what you get. You can work with bigger files, no problem, but the output, the delivery is always under 4K, which can be a problem, but not for many people, I think. One thing which is a really painful thing is missing of OFX plugins. OFX plugins are part of Resolve, so Resolve Free and also the Studio version has a whole bunch of OFX plugins, and in the paid version you have much more of these plugins built in. And these plugins are quite good, because you have plugins, for example, for really nice lens flares, light leaks. You have denoising functions which are really close to the leading software Neat Video. The Neat Video plugin alone costs, I think, around $200. So yeah, it's really cool that you get these tools inside of the paid version of Resolve integrated. And if you use then Fusion inside of Resolve, you have all the OFX plugins also in your Fusion environment, so you can directly use them. And this is a little disadvantage of the Fusion Studio, because there you don't get the OFX plugins of Resolve. That's the reason why I really often tend for my projects to work in Resolve in the Fusion environment, because I get all the OFX plugins. Also, in the Resolve version, there's the color page, which is Hollywood standard. Inside of the color page, we have AI-driven tools, for example, for object removing, magic masks. In the new version 18, you get a depth generator and so on. And these tools you can then, through a workflow or directly use inside of the Fusion page, which is also for me a really big advantage of the paid version, that you get that. And another point why I like the integrated environment is that I really easy can share data between the color page and Fusion. The cool thing at this point also is that you see later your comp in context of your edit, for example, and maybe also your sound design and things like that. You see, it's not easy to say free or paid. Start with free, and then you will see that this software is really worth the $300. The cool thing is, and this is something I really like about Blackmagic design, it's no subscription. You pay it once and you get the updates and 2 softwares with the same dongle or activation code. Okay, so that's my introduction. I hope this helps you for the first clearance here. And now we want to start Fusion Studio to get a hang of the Fusion workflow. And like I've said, if you are only working with the Fusion page inside of Resolve, please take your time, watch this, because then you have the workflows, the terminology, which we later use in Resolve again. Let's get started. I use here Fusion 18 for that. It's still beta, but the layout is the same like in 17, but I wanted to give you the most recent version of that. Here we are now in Fusion Studio version 18, and the first thing we want to talk about is the UI. The UI in Fusion has changed a lot between version 9, which was Fusion for most old Fusion users, and then the Blackmagic design, which then came, and it's really controversial if this design really helps, but it is like it is. Let's talk about this design here. We have 2 viewers here, which you can use. If you only want one viewer, you see that every viewer has here some icons, and you can go here to full screen of one of these viewers here if you like, and you come back with the same icon here again. Then we have here areas which we can switch on and off here, the nodes graph, the effects panel on the right side, the inspector, which is really important, the keyframes, and also the spline editor. And you also see that these areas here can have a full column or a half column. For this, we have here on the right side this little icon here. You see now the node graph fills this here completely. And the same here, if you have many effects and you want to see more and you don't need the node graph at this point, you can bring this up here, and then you have here a list of all your effects which are at the moment here inside of Fusion. And then the question is, okay, you want to start now with the composition. Where are the settings for the composition? These are made in the preferences, and I go into the preferences now. Here you see under Mac, you can find it here. Under PC, I think it's under File or Edit. I think you will find it. And if you're now in the preferences, you will see that you have two areas. One area is the global and default settings, and one area here, or more, because you can have more compositions open at the same time inside of Fusion, you have a list here of the settings of the composition, which you have opened at the moment here. And the global settings here are like a template. So here you make your basic settings, and every new composition you generate from this point on will have these settings here, these globals. And you see here, for example, the frame format. I switched it over because most of the time I work with HD stuff. So I made here my decision that I want to have as a default format HD 1080. I want to have a frame rate of 25 frames per second, and I unchecked the lock depth because you can work inside of Fusion in a lower bit depth, and in the full render, if you then output it, you have then a higher bit depth. And you see I've changed that. So for my normal work, I use 16-bit floats for my work, and in my output I use 32-bit as the output, or also the calculation which is going on. It's not in the output. You can also output then with lower bit depth, but the whole calculation is done in 32-bit. So this is something you can change here if you like. If you want to have these independent, deactivate here the lock depth, then you can change that here. And this is only a template for the next composition. If you want to change something for the actual composition you are now working in, you can select it here. Now you can override the settings again like you want. So that's the basic idea here of the composition. Then you save it, and then you can start working. For an example, I think I want to show you a little bit how to work here. It's not a Fusion introduction, it's about the workflow. You remember the topics. So let's dive into that here really fast. We have a node graph, so we need nodes like in other applications like Nuke, for example, or geometry nodes inside of Blender or Houdini. To load something, we need a node for that, and this is a loader. Where do you get nodes? You have this little toolbar here, which is customizable. Here is a loader, so you can use that. You also can go under effects here, and you see here under tools, there are categories here, and under IO, you also find a loader, which you can then drag here into your node graph to use it, or you can click it. And you also have under the keyboard shortcut, and for this I have to be here in the nodes, shift space, and then you can select the tool here. Every tool has a shortcut or a short naming. More and more you will learn these, so you don't have to type loader all the time. It's absolutely enough to type LD for loader, and then you get this node here. Okay, let's make a loader here. I click here, now my file browser opens, and you can now navigate here in your history, in your favorites you defined, or your devices or system links here to the data which you want to use. In my case, we start with a video here, which is Snowbridge. And if you select something here, you can pop out this right area here where we have a preview window. And what you now can do is you can scrub here over the video to see what's inside of that. You also can switch between colors and the alpha channel here. You see that you have a gamma correction here, which is important if you work with 3D stuff, for example, from Blender or Houdini or Maya. So really often we have linear files which are really dark to see, so you can click that. And if you have utility passes or technical passes, which you have to normalize to see something, a depth pass, for example, you have this normalize button here. So you see, it's really cool. And you also can look into the metadata here. Let's open this. And now this node here is loaded. The inspector here is context sensitive. So if you select something, you see here the settings for this node. To now see something in the viewer, you have to connect it. And in opposite of applications like Nuke, we don't have a viewer node. We directly name the viewer. So this is the viewer number 1. This is the viewer number 2. And the shortcut is exactly that. So if you select this node here, you can press the 1 key on your keyboard to load now this node here into viewer 1. You can also remove it with the 1 key again, so it's a toggle, and this is sometimes important if you have, for example, you don't see viewer 1 because you have viewer 2 in full screen, but you still output something to viewer 1. It takes performance and you don't want that, for example, in bigger comps. So keep that in mind, you can remove it. You also can use these little toggles here, which are quite small, or a really convenient way is also you can take a node and you can drag and drop it into a viewer, and then you see it here. But more about this in another lesson about really compositing basics inside of Fusion. So we have now here our footage. I go to full screen here for the footage, and we see that our comp is at the moment 250 frames, which you can change here if you like. But the question is, how long is this footage? Because these 250 frames were set in the settings, you remember. You can see here on this loader node that we have a global in and out point. So you see this here is not the full footage. The full footage would be from frame 0 to 364 frames. So we only see a part of that because our timeline was shorter. What you now can do is you can change here, if you like, the amount of frames which you have in your timeline. And the question is, what is this here? And these yellow bars, these are a preview area. So if you only work in a small chunk of your composite, then you can set this here really easily. With these 2 bars, it's the same like setting them here. So this is something you can do here, and you can stretch them out to the whole thing. If you now press play here, you now see that the footage is playing and caching at the same time. So on the right side here, you see now my RAM. It's filling up here, and remember, if you don't have enough RAM, it will not play completely. And so I set before in the settings my work depth of my footage to 16-bit. Later, it's calculated for the output in 32-bit. But it helps me with the RAM also. And now you see it plays in real time. You see here the playback rate, 25 frames a second, and that's the way you load footage here. It's quite easily. The next thing is I want to add more stuff here to it, so logo or something else. So let's go back into the loader, and I go 1 up here, and we have here now 2 logos, which are PNGs, and I can now go here and say I want to have this Fusion logo and maybe also this Resolve logo. And this here sometimes happens if you have selected something. So it's a preference thing that you get a merge automatically, which we don't need at this point. Let's see how these logos look. And we can flick them in here to see them. Or you can now use your second monitor like in video editing. So you have a source monitor and a program monitor. This is possible. And now we have these here. And maybe you also want for your comp a text. So we can have a text tool here. And here I can show you a little trick. If you say, okay, this is the starting point for my comp, which is now this video here. I go to the first frame. And I want to add something here to this node tree. You can bring the text in, and then you have to add a merge node, and then you have to connect these and so on. This takes time. What you also can do is the viewer sits here now on the output of this snow bridge. You can take a node and you can directly drag it into the viewer, which means now that Fusion knows, okay, you want to add this here to this And you see Fusion is now making the job for you. It generates the merge node and the text node, and the viewer is also set to this node now here. Let's make a right mouse button click, go to Arrange Tools and say to Connected, so then these objects are snapping a little bit better. And now we can use this text here. We write something, here Fusion Studio for example, to have here a knowledge where we make our comp. And then inside of the merge node, there are transformations which we can use to now position that. If you ever have the problem that then something is not in the viewport anymore, this can be that here, and these buttons are interesting here, that this here is the auto proxy. You can change them with the right mouse button if you like, but in most cases I deactivate them because it's absolutely fast enough here on my graphics card and I want to see where I place something. Okay, now we have placed that. Now we want to have these two logos. I have to merge them into the tree, and there's another trick. You can take the output here of this graphics and you can go to the output here of the merge node. And if you drag that, then you see you get a new merge. This time the viewer is not changed because this was a change inside of the node tree. So you can press the 2 key by selecting this first, or you can drag the merge into the viewer. Inside of the merge, I told you we have transformations, so we can make something like that. Then we take this logo, make the same thing here. I drag it in, make a transformation again, and I place it here, and that's it. It's not about how to use Fusion at all, but it's more about the workflow. You've seen this is node-based compositing, like you have it in other applications also. The question now is, if you're now inside of a Fusion Studio environment, how to output. So what's the result now of this? And for this, we use a saver node. We can add a saver node here. Okay, this is the saver node. If you add a loader or a saver, you always get this file dialog. I can now say, okay, I want to have a new folder here on my desktop, which is named render. And I go into that. Now I can name here my rendering. Let's say this is my first comp. Now I want to have the numbering of the frames, and inside of Fusion you normally type digits here. So you say 0001, which is then replaced by the Fusion saver with the right frame numbering, which you have on your timeline. And then you can also type an extension, for example, PNG. If you now want to hook this up and change some settings, select your saver, and here is now your saver, which you now can use. For example, here you see your output format. We have here for the export more settings, how the processing works, and so on. I think you will find everything which you normally need. But let's talk really briefly, and this is important if we later go to Resolve, how now the color space and the depth is managed. You remember we set the depth for the calculation to 32-bit later. But sometimes you say, okay, we worked in 16-bit here. Some stuff here doesn't need to work in 16-bit, and I don't want to use this resource in my comp because my comp gets later really big. What you can do is we can select here every of these sources and look here into these tabs, and you see there's a file tab where you have the connection to the file. We have an import tab, and here we see the color depth of this node, and you see it's default. Default means look into the comp preferences, which we saw at the beginning, and so we know together that we used 16-bit. You also see it here, and if you hover with your mouse here, you also see it here, 16-bit float, and it's in the memory at the moment. If you want to change that for this branch here, what you can do is you can go here into depth and you can override that. So you say, I say it's absolutely enough to use integer 8, for example, for this part of the comp. And if I drag this now into the viewer, you see this is integer 8. If you now go here into this branch, which is 16-bit, you will see that this here is now 16-bit. And this is something which gives you a great flexibility inside of your work. You can change in every branch in the source nodes here how you want to work with color depth and things like that. And this is a flexibility which you can keep in mind if you later come to Resolve, because in Resolve we have an integrated environment. And this sometimes is a little bit different, so keep that in mind. Okay, now I think I have done everything here. If you are now want to render out, you can go here and click render, and then it renders out the whole thing to your hard drive. There's a dialog popping up, which is the render settings. We have two configurations. We have here the frame range, which you want to generate, and really important, if you come from other compositing solutions, we can have a network group render. So we can use network rendering. There are render clients which you can install with the paid version, and you have a whole render farm for that if you like. And then you can start the rendering, which I don't do here because this video is quite long. And I want to show you some more concepts which you have to keep in mind if you're starting out with Fusion. One is what happens if you import now, for example, an EXR sequence or something like that. So let's take a loader here. I deselected everything, otherwise I get a merge. So I deselect everything. I click here. And I now go back into my trainings data, and you see I have here a folder with the sequences. The first thing I want to show you here is now, for example, this car animation sequence. If you have a sequence, you normally have it numbered. Here is a little tick for gather sequences. So you see you can load them as single images, which is interesting if you have images from a digital camera or so on. But if you say, yeah, this is an animation, you can click here, gather sequence, and then you see it here. If you select it here, now we see here, you can scrub through that again. You see this car animation, but now comes a really interesting point. You see it's extremely dark. And you remember I said that if I work, for example, in an external application in linear workflow, which I've done here in Blender, you will see that the images are too dark. To see now into that, you can click this gamma here. And then you get a gamma of 2.2 for this viewer, and you can see better what's going on here. So this is an advantage of this little viewer thing. Let's load that now. Okay, here we are. I flick it in. And now you see something interesting. You see this checkerboard. This is interesting inside of Fusion. If you have somewhere transparency, you see it in the viewer, which can be good, but sometimes it's also distracting. So to get rid of that, you can use your right mouse button, and here you have many submenus where you can configure your viewer. This is sometimes a little bit not so ordered, so you also can go here to this short menu, which is a little bit more convenient for working. So you have a checker underlay here, you can deactivate that or activate that if you want to see that. Let's go into the file itself. One little trick which you can do here in Studio is this here has a different length. You see we only have some images here. What you can do is you can drag and drop this node here onto the timeline, and then you see that you get a range which is exactly the length of the footage, which is quite convenient. Okay, let's cache this through. And now you see that the car is dark again. So you remember it's a color management thing. This footage here is the linear, and if you hover your mouse over that, you've learned that, we will see we load it and then convert it to 16-bit float. If you later make your final, it's 32-bit, but that's not the problem. This is a gamma problem. So how to change that now? We can use a transformation here, so we can change the gamma for this, but this is not the thing we are after. What we are after is, for example, we want to stay in this linear world, but we want to see in the viewer something different. And for this, in every viewer, inside of the Studio version and also in Resolve, we have this here, a LUT. And if you go to the right side of the LUT, we have here the Fusion Viewer LUT, the gamut, and so on. And you can go here to the Fusion Viewer LUT here. Let's open that. So first it's activated, and then you go to Edit. And then you see you can load now LUTs here, and you have here a color gamma and an alpha gamma, which you now can change. So if you go here, you can say this is 2.2, and then you see, okay, it's now correcting only the viewer for you to show that. This is sometimes a little bit tedious to do it all the time. So what I've showed you in my first lesson, when we installed the Reactor, I normally install Stefan Ihringer's viewer LUTs. So we've done that. If you want to see that, watch the first lesson. And so we have here now in our list here Rec 709 and sRGB, which are from this free plugin. And so you can say this is Rec 709 and you can select it here. And keep in mind, if you have two viewers, every viewer is independent. So you have to do here, if you need that, the same thing again. You see, Fusion is quite flexible in working, but you have to know what you want, and this is something you have to keep in mind. Last thing is how to get rid now of this short area, because our full program is much longer than these 16 frames here. What you can do is you can make a right mouse button click here, and this is really often in Fusion. You can click with the right mouse button also on UI elements. So if you make a right mouse button click here, you can auto render range again. So it searches for the longest thing or the full program. You also can go here and drag these. This is something we've done before, but this is much faster. And like I've said, right mouse button. You have seen here the auto proxies, right mouse button. You can check that. Here's motion blur, right mouse button. You can set motion blur settings and so on. So try this also. I think that's nearly enough. The last thing I want to show you here, and then we are really finished, is how to work with audio. Sometimes you need to work together with audio because you make motion graphics or so. This is different in the studio version than in Resolve. What you can do here is you have here this little speaker, but it doesn't make any sense because we have no audio at all here. But you can make a right mouse button click again onto the audio, and here you can say choose. And then you go into your data and take an audio file. Thanks to Video Copilot for the free typer sound here. We have it here. Now you bring it in. And now you see that you have here now a list of all the audio files you've loaded. You can also offset them if you like. And if you then play, you maybe hear in my capturing that you have now the audio, and you can switch it on and off here, or you can deactivate it at all. I think that's enough for today. I hope you understand a little bit how Fusion in the studio version works now. And in the second part of this lesson, we will take now this new knowledge how Fusion thinks into Resolve and the Fusion pages. And we will try to find exactly these features again, and also understand how the integrated environment of Resolve works. If you have any questions, please write me in the comments below. I have fun to work with you. See you in the next part of this lesson number 2. Your Helge Maus. Have fun.